He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it in the same tone he used when asking if we were out of milk or if the mail had come.
Flat.
Thoughtless. You're just comfortable these days, Brian said, not looking up from his tablet. I don't mean that in a bad way. I didn't respond at first. I just sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, frozen between the salmon he liked and the roasted carrots I had burned slightly. Again, the word echoed in my head louder than it should have. Comfortable. Not beautiful. Not warm. Not radiant or steady or capable. Just comfortable. I set my fork down quietly. It clicked against the plate, and that click, absurdly, was the loudest sound in the room. Brian didn't look up. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind that passes without a name. He was home late again after drinks with the team. I had asked earlier if I should come meet them, just casually, not pressing. He shook his head. It's just for the newer associates, he said, reaching for his cufflinks. Kind of a bonding thing. He used to want me there. Wanted me to meet the young hires, talk to the partners, smile at the stories he'd already told me 100 times. But somewhere along the way, I had become the second chair in an orchestra where I used to be the conductor. I told myself it was normal. This was what 28 years of marriage looked like. Familiar, predictable, worn in like an old pair of jeans. But I never asked to be comfortable. After dinner, he rinsed his plate and left it in the sink. Not in the dishwasher. Just beside it. Like always. I've got a call in 20, he said, grabbing his laptop. Don't wait up. I nodded. He left. And the silence that followed him felt like it had weight. Like something had taken a seat across from me and wasn't going to leave. I finished my wine slowly. Stared out the window at the small yard we once dreamed of turning into a garden. Now it was mostly overgrown mint and the stubborn rosemary bush I couldn't get rid of. I had worn lipstick that night. Nothing bold, just a soft berry shade. I hadn't worn it in weeks. Not since our anniversary dinner, when he said I didn't need to fuss so much.
Fuss.
Comfortable. These words weren't daggers. They were duller than that, like water, wearing down the edges of something once sharp. I walked upstairs to the bathroom and stared at my reflection under the harsh vanity lights. The lipstick was still on, faint at the edges. My hair had frizzed slightly at the sides. I looked like me, but who was that? I used to know. I used to fill rooms without raising my voice. I used to teach art history at the local college, standing in front of young minds and connecting Cézanne to grief, Van Gogh to longing. I was good, respected. I gave it up when Brian made partner, and the kids needed more help at home.
Just for a little while, I told myself,
I'll go back. I never did. Comfortable became the story I told myself, the trade I accepted. And now I couldn't remember the last time someone looked at me like I was anything else. The next morning, I woke before Brian and padded downstairs in slippers that used to be pink but had faded to an unremarkable beige. I stood at the sink, staring at the cold coffee pot I'd forgotten to prep. And then I did something strange. I pulled out my favorite teacup from the back of the cabinet. The chipped one with the floral rim I'd stopped using because it didn't match the set. I brewed myself a proper cup of Earl Grey, sliced exactly 2 orange peels into it, and carried it outside. It was still dark. Just the beginning of morning light bleeding into the horizon. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, and sipped slowly. It was the first intentional thing I'd done for myself in months. And it didn't fix anything. Not the dull ache in my chest. Not the word comfortable still lingering in the air like a musty curtain. But it was a start. Later that afternoon, I passed by the hall closet, the one we never touched. I opened it on impulse. Old coats. Empty vases. A box labeled Mom's Stuff. I pulled it out and sat on the floor. Inside were dozens of sketchbooks. My sketchbooks. From years ago. Back when I taught. Back when I created. My fingers trembled as I flipped through them. Loose lines of Paris rooftops. Shading studies. The rough charcoal outline of our daughter Ava sleeping on the couch at age 6, her hair falling like ribbon over her cheek. I don't remember drawing that. But there it was. Proof that I had once seen the world in a way that made me feel. That night I didn't make salmon. I didn't wear lipstick. I didn't even wait for Brian to get home. I sat at the kitchen table, sketchbook open, pencil in hand, and drew the view from the window, the way the rosemary bush curled slightly at the top like it was trying to escape. When he came in, he looked surprised. "No dinner?" "I wasn't hungry," I said without looking up. He paused, then opened the fridge, grumbling slightly. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't apologize. I kept drawing. Something had cracked open.
Small.
Barely noticeable. But I felt it. It wasn't a declaration. It was a whisper. But it was mine. Before we continue, take a moment to let me know where you're watching from the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to more powerful stories like this one. It started with the sketches. 1 became 2, then 5. By the end of the week, my fingers were stained with graphite again, familiar smudges I hadn't seen in years. I liked the way the pencil dust clung to the edge of my hand, as if it knew its way back home. I didn't tell Brian. Not out of secrecy, but because there was nothing to tell. Not yet. He noticed I didn't sit on the couch next to him as often. Instead, I brought my tea to the kitchen table and bent over my sketchbook in silence. He didn't ask what I was working on. I think he assumed it was a grocery list. One night, he looked up from his tablet and said, "You've been in your own world lately." I looked at him and offered a gentle smile. "Maybe I like it there." He blinked. Just once. Then went back to reading whatever news article had absorbed him. The next day, I cleared the guest room. It used to be Ava's room, lavender walls, glow-in-the-dark stars still clinging to the ceiling. She had moved out 4 years ago, but the room had stayed frozen in time. I dusted the shelves, packed away her old posters, and opened the windows. Fresh air rushed in like a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. In the garage, buried beneath Christmas decorations and Brian's golf bags, I found my easel. The wood was dry, slightly splintered, but still strong. I ran my hand over it like greeting an old friend. I set it up in the guest room near the window and placed a blank canvas on it. Not to paint, not yet. Just to look.
To feel what it meant to have space again.
That night at dinner, I served myself first. Just a small thing, habit, muscle memory, but Brian noticed. "You usually plate mine first," he said with a laugh, reaching for the bread. "I know," I replied simply. He looked at me a beat longer than usual. Not annoyed, just curious. Like he had spotted something unfamiliar in a familiar painting. The truth was, I had spent years arranging my days around his preferences. His favorite meals, his routines, the way he liked his shirts folded. I wasn't resentful, not exactly. Just tired. Of bending. So I began unbending. I bought new dish towels, bright teal, bold against the beige kitchen. I started waking up before sunrise to sketch the trees out back, just as their silhouettes began to form against the purpling sky. I stopped buying the vanilla yogurt he liked because I never liked it. He didn't comment on the yogurt. But he did glance at the easel one morning as he passed the guest room. "What's all this?" I turned from a canvas, brush in hand. "I'm painting again," I said.
A pause.
"You haven't done that in ages." "I know," I said, dipping the brush again. "I missed it." He didn't step further into the room, just nodded slowly and walked away. No compliment, no interest. And strangely, that was fine. For once, I didn't need him to see it, because I did. A few days later, I was in the grocery store when I ran into Claire. We used to teach at the same college, shared an office with mismatched chairs and a leaky ceiling. She looked at me with a spark of recognition and a small gasp.
"Maya?"
"Maya Lowell? God, it's been forever." We hugged.
Tight.
Familiar. We stood by the organic spinach talking like no time had passed. She asked what I'd been doing, how the kids were, if I ever thought about teaching again. And for the first time, I didn't fumble for a vague, tidy answer. "I think about it a lot," I said honestly. "Lately more than ever." She nodded knowingly. "I remember how your lectures used to pull people in. You used to say Cezanne painted like he was sculpting the truth." I laughed. "That sounds like me." "It was you. And it was brilliant." We exchanged numbers. She invited me to a faculty mixer next month. Nothing formal, just some of the old crew getting together. You should come. I said I'd think about it. And I did. For days after, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. Not to check for flaws, but to study my face the way I used to study portraits in the museum. I wasn't young, not in the way the world markets youth. But there was something else now. Something stronger beneath the surface. It wasn't radiance. It was presence. Brian noticed in his own way. "You've been glowing lately," he said over coffee. "That new skin cream working?" I laughed softly. "It's not the cream." He looked puzzled. I didn't elaborate. Because the truth was, it wasn't about a product. It was about purpose. Every evening now, I painted. The strokes came slowly at first, like dusting off a language I hadn't spoken in years. My first canvas was a still life, a teacup, lemon slices, the edge of a book. Ordinary things. But halfway through, I realized what I was really painting was stillness. My stillness. The kind I hadn't allowed myself in years. And with every stroke, I felt myself becoming more solid. One night, I heard Brian on the phone in his office. "Yeah, she's been doing her own thing lately," he said, voice low but audible.
She's fine.
"Just, I don't know. Focused on painting or something. Or something." I smiled at the phrase. That something was becoming me again. The invitation sat on the kitchen counter for a full day before I touched it again. Claire had followed up with a quick text. "Hope you can make it. Faculty mixer, Wednesday at 6, Rosa Cafe. Casual. Just show up. Just show up." Those 3 words echoed as I stood in the hallway, holding the printed card she'd slid into my hand outside the store. In another life, I would have gone without thinking.
But now?
Now it felt like stepping onto a stage after forgetting the lines to a play I used to star in. Still, something inside me stirred. Not anxiety. Not dread. Something that felt eerily close to curiosity. That night, I stood in front of the guest room closet, the one I had quietly repurposed as my own, and ran my hands over the hangers. My wardrobe had long been curated for usefulness. Sweaters that didn't wrinkle. Blouses in beige, navy, and forgiving shapes. But tucked behind them, behind the practical cardigans and elastic waistbands, was a dress I hadn't worn in years. Emerald green. V-neck. 3/4 sleeves. It had been too bold for PDA nights and too dressy for dinner at home. But it used to make me feel like I had something to say. I tried it on. It still fit. I stared at myself in the mirror for a full minute. My arms were a little softer now. The lines at the corners of my eyes a little deeper. But the dress still knew me. Still draped like I had something worth celebrating. Brian noticed when I walked downstairs. "Going somewhere?" he asked, glancing up from his phone. "I am," I said, pulling on my coat. He didn't ask where. I didn't offer. When I walked into Rosa Cafe, the room buzzed with low laughter and clinking cutlery. It smelled like roasted tomatoes and espresso. I scanned the room, unsure where to go until I heard my name. "Maya." Claire stood waving from a long table near the back, already surrounded by half a dozen people I recognized in flashes. Dr. Ellis from the philosophy department, Gina who used to run the campus writing center, a few newer faces I didn't yet know. "Look who finally decided to show up," Claire teased, pulling me into a side hug. "I almost didn't," I admitted. Then I remembered I used to belong here. "You still do." That sentence, it landed in me like a stone dropped into a still lake. I didn't know how much I needed someone else to say it until she did. We sat. We ordered wine.
We laughed.
For 2 hours, I felt like a version of myself I hadn't seen in a decade. The conversation moved easily from department gossip to books we'd been meaning to read. At one point, someone asked if I'd heard about the adjunct spot opening for a spring seminar in visual storytelling. I smiled. "I haven't, but it sounds like something I would have loved to teach." Dr. Ellis leaned forward. "You still could." I hesitated. Could I? The table got quiet for a moment, and then Claire chimed in. "Maya, they're desperate for someone with experience. You had one of the best student feedback records in the department." "I haven't taught in years." You haven't forgotten how, she said. Later that night, as I walked back to my car, a breeze tugged gently at my scarf. I paused beside the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of myself, smiling. Not the forced smile I gave neighbors or waiters. A real one.
Soft.
Uncontrolled. I liked how I looked in the dark glass, like someone coming back from somewhere far away. When I got home, Brian was in bed. His reading light was on, casting a pale circle of brightness on his side of the sheets. He looked up. You're back late. It was a dinner with old friends, I said, removing my earrings. He studied me for a moment. You look nice. It wasn't unkind. It just didn't land. I thanked him and went to wash my face. The next morning, something small shifted. Not between us. Inside me. I made my tea with orange peel like always now and opened my laptop. I searched for the seminar listing Claire had mentioned. It was there. Visual storytelling in art history. Seeking experienced instructor for 10-week spring seminar. Evening class. Flexible curriculum. I stared at the screen. I didn't click apply. Not yet. But I didn't close the tab either. That afternoon, I began a new painting. Not a still life this time. A self-portrait. Not in detail, just the shape of my body, the tilt of my head, the outline of my hand holding a paintbrush. As I filled in the shadow around my arm, I realized what I was painting wasn't really me. It was the space I had once left for myself. And I was filling it in. That night, over a quiet dinner, Brian said, "You've been different lately." I paused. "I've been awake lately." He looked at me like I'd spoken a language he didn't know. Maybe I had. I didn't click apply right away. Instead, I made tea. The good kind, loose leaf, brewed slow, and I drank it outside, wrapped in my shawl, the morning sun brushing my cheek like a question I hadn't answered yet. Then I went inside and opened the hallway cabinet. It was the one I used to call my drawer. Not because it held anything special, just a disorganized mess of things I'd once cared about. Old lecture notes, lesson plans, and used stationery, paper clips rusted together in the corners. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside, I found a folder labeled Spring Seminar, 2014. My last year teaching. It was thinner than I remembered. I sat on the living room floor and leafed through the contents. Slides on Frida Kahlo's early work, a timeline of narrative structures in 20th century painting, old student essays marked with comments in red pen. One page was folded in half, a handwritten thank you note from a student named Lila. You taught me how to see stories in everything, even in myself. I didn't know art could do that. I read it twice. Then I read it again. By the time I stood up, my legs had fallen asleep, but my heart was wide awake. I returned to my laptop, opened the job listing again, and this time, I didn't hesitate.
Click. Apply. Attaque résumé.
Submit. No fanfare. No celebratory music. Just silence.
And a heartbeat.
That afternoon, I was in the middle of rinsing paintbrushes when Brian walked into the kitchen. He glanced at the open laptop. "What are you working on?" he asked. I didn't turn around. I just applied for a teaching position.
Pause.
Oh. He walked to the fridge. Like a part-time thing? Yes. He poured himself water and leaned against the counter. Do you think that's a good idea?
I turned then. Calm.
Still holding a damp brush. I think it's a necessary idea. He nodded once. Okay. That was it. No congratulations. No encouragement. Just neutral air. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't asking for permission. I was informing him of reality. 3 days later, I got the email. Subject line, offer letter, visual storytelling seminar. I read the body of the message aloud to myself, savoring every syllable. We're thrilled to welcome you back. Your experience and student evaluation speak for themselves. Attached is the official offer for your review. I printed the letter. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I bought myself a new planner. A real one. Hardcover. Lined pages. Weekly layout. The kind of planner you get when you know your time matters. Brian noticed it on the dining room table the next morning. New calendar? Planner, I said. Classes start in February. He nodded. You'll be busy then. I hope so. I said it without smiling. Because it wasn't a hope. It was a plan. That weekend, Julia came by to drop off some baking pans and stayed for coffee. She noticed the easel in the guest room first. Mom, she said, stepping into the doorway. You're painting again? I nodded. Started a few weeks ago. She tilted her head, studying the unfinished canvas. You look lighter. That's what Claire said too. Claire from your department?
Mum.
We reconnected. Actually, I paused. I'm teaching a class next semester. Her eyes widened. You're serious? Completely. She blinked once, then walked over and hugged me so tightly it surprised both of us. I'm proud of you, she whispered. Those words, I'm proud of you, felt like sunlight. The kind that comes after a long, gray winter. That night, I sat in bed reading an old art theory book. Brian came in late, as usual. He glanced at the lamp still on. You're up late. I nodded. I'm prepping for my class. He didn't say much after that. Just changed and crawled into bed. The silence between us wasn't cold. Not exactly. Just familiar. The kind that settles in when two people have grown side by side, but stopped looking at each other. He turned off his light. Mine stayed on. And I kept reading. The next morning, I woke early and drove out to the university campus, just to walk it. My classroom hadn't been assigned yet, but I didn't care. I wanted to feel the halls under my feet again. Students passed me in clusters, messy buns, coffee cups, backpacks slung over one shoulder. I used to be one of them. Then I used to guide them. And now I would again. I stood near the faculty offices for a long moment, hand resting against a doorframe, and whispered softly to myself. You're back. Not to the school. To yourself. The classroom was smaller than I remembered. Maybe it had always been this size. 12 desks and a horseshoe, flickering overhead lights, and a dry erase board stained with the ghosts of past lectures. But it felt different now. Not lesser. Just quieter. Like it was waiting. I ran my hand along the edge of the instructor's desk. The wood was worn and scratched, and someone had left behind a mug with a chipped handle and a sticker that said, "Trust the process." I smiled at that. I placed my planner down, flipped open to the first week of February, and took a deep breath. The scent of old paper and whiteboard marker filled my lungs. It was familiar, grounding, in a strange way. Like the air hadn't changed since the last time I stood at the front of a room like this. I had arrived 2 hours early. Part of me wanted to make sure everything was in order. The projector worked. The laptop connected. The markers hadn't dried out. But the truth was, I just wanted to sit here. To feel this space belonged to me again. To own it. My class was small, 8 students on the roster. Visual storytelling was an elective, and most of them had selected it out of curiosity or creative need, not obligation. I liked that. At 5:55 p.m., they began to trickle in. I stood near the board, holding a stack of printed syllabi, pretending not to be nervous. But my hands were cold. My fingers trembled, just slightly, like they used to before a gallery talk. At 6:02, I cleared my throat and began. Welcome to Visual Storytelling, I said. My name is Professor Maya Lowell. A few heads tilted. One student raised her hand. Are you the same Lowell who used to teach art history 211? I blinked. Yes. That was me. She smiled. My older sister had you. She said your class made her switch majors. Laughter rippled. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. Not out of embarrassment, but something else. A kind of soft pride I hadn't worn in years. Well, I hope I don't disappoint. The class went better than I expected. We talked about framing and tone, the emotional weight of negative space, the tension of incomplete lines. I used slides I'd made nearly a decade ago, refreshed, of course, but the core of them still held up. I asked them to bring in a single image next week that represented a turning point in their lives. Any format is fine, I told them. A photo, a sketch, a painting, even a screenshot. Just something that feels like a hinge. They scribbled notes, nodded, and when the session ended at 7:28 on the no one rushed out the door. One of them, a tall, soft-spoken boy named Luis, lingered after the others had gone. He held his phone loosely in one hand. "I liked what you said about negative space," he said. "It's weird. I never thought of silence as part of a story." I looked at him, truly looked, and replied, "Sometimes it's the most honest part." He smiled. "Thanks, Professor." When he left, I sat back down at the instructor's desk and stared at the board. The marker cap in my hand felt weightier than it should have. I clicked it shut and whispered to myself, "Still here." On the drive home, I didn't listen to music, just the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of coins in the glove box. The sky was a deep navy by the time I pulled into the driveway. The porch light was off. Inside, Brian was on the couch, a basketball game lighting his face in shifting blue and gold. "Hey," he called without turning. "How'd it go?" I hung on my coat, slipped off my shoes. "It went well."
Cool.
He tossed a handful of popcorn into his mouth and pointed at the screen. "You see that? 3-point range." I watched the screen for a second, a blur of athletes in motion. Then I turned and walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, closed it again.
I didn't want anything.
I wanted to sit back in that classroom. That night, I pulled my sketchbook out and opened to a blank page. I didn't know what I was drawing, just that I needed to move my hand, needed to translate something from inside me into shape. I ended up sketching the classroom. Not perfectly, just an impression. The curve of the desk, the tilt of the projector, the shadows behind Luis's chair. It wasn't art. It was evidence. The next morning, I got up early to finalize lesson plans. I was halfway through rewriting a slide on emotional sequencing when Brian wandered in, scratching his head. "Didn't sleep much," he said, pouring coffee. "You're up early." "I'm working." He looked down at my laptop, squinted at the image of Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, and asked, "That your class stuff?" "Yes." He leaned against the counter. "Seems like a lot for part-time." I didn't respond, because that wasn't a real question. It was a veiled suggestion, one I'd heard 1,000 times before. "You don't need to go all in. You're doing too much. It's just a hobby. You're already busy enough." But I wasn't busy enough. I had been empty. And now, for the first time in years, I was filling again. "I like it," I said instead. "It's good to stretch." He shrugged and turned back to his coffee. When he left for work, I stayed at the table, refining lesson 3. I didn't even hear the door close behind him, because I was thinking about negative space again, about how sometimes, in the silence, we finally hear our own voice. The third week of class, Luis brought in a photo of his grandmother. It was black and white, slightly faded, her hands kneading dough on a flowered countertop. You couldn't see her face, only the curve of her back, the set of her shoulders, the flour on her knuckles. "This was the day she decided to leave my grandfather," he said quietly. The room fell still. She didn't tell anyone. She just baked bread, cleaned the counters, and walked out with a single suitcase. She didn't even say goodbye. But I remember this photo. My cousin took it by accident that morning. And it's the only picture I have of her right before she became someone new. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then I nodded. "It's beautiful." Luis looked surprised. "But you can't even see her face." "Exactly," I said. "It's a portrait of what wasn't said." He smiled. "My mom always said I got my quiet from her." After class, I stayed behind longer than usual, cleaned the whiteboard, collected loose papers. I felt full. Not in a rushed, chaotic way, but in the slow, steady way that good food settles in your body after a long fast. When I got home, the table was already set. That was new. Brian stood at the stove, spooning risotto onto 2 plates. He turned when I walked in. "Hey," he said. "Thought I'd cook tonight." I blinked. "Okay." He gestured at the wine glasses. "Open that Chardonnay you like. The citrusy one." I hesitated a beat. "You remembered that?" He shrugged. "Figured we should have a real dinner. Haven't had one in a while." We sat. The food was good. Not perfect, but honest. He'd added too much rosemary, and the rice was slightly undercooked, but the effort hummed louder than the flaws. How's class? He asked, halfway through his second bite. Rewarding, I said. Challenging in a way I missed. He nodded. You seem different lately. Different how? He took a sip of wine. I don't know. Lighter. Focused. Like you're somewhere else even when you're here. I didn't respond immediately,
Because part of me was somewhere else.
not physically, but emotionally. In the past few weeks, I had found something that had once been buried. And now that it was unearthed, I wasn't ready to put it away again. I decided not to deflect. I think I'm just more present with myself. He raised an eyebrow. Is that a subtle dig? No, I said gently. It's not about you. That seemed to confuse him more. After dinner, he cleared the plates without me asking. Another surprise. He even wiped down the counters. Then he turned to me and said, Would you want to come to the firm's spring dinner next month? I blinked. You want me there?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a big thing. Just a dinner. You don't have to if you're busy. For years, he'd gone to those dinners without inviting me. At first, he gave reasons. It's just a small team thing. Or you'd be bored. Eventually, he stopped offering reasons.
And I stopped asking.
Now he was inviting me back in. But I wasn't sure if I wanted back in. I'll think about it, I said. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had already drifted off, one arm flung across his pillow. His invite wasn't cruel or manipulative. It was tentative, hesitant, like someone trying to touch a flame without getting burned. But I couldn't ignore the truth. He was noticing that I had stopped orbiting him, that I had begun constructing a life that didn't revolve around his schedule, his moods, his definitions of what comfortable meant. And now, something in him was beginning to panic, not with aggression, but with politeness, with small offerings, with dinner and wine and quiet questions that tried to lead me back toward the center. But I wasn't walking back. Not yet. The next day, I stopped by the campus library after class. I wandered the stacks of the art section like a tourist returning to a once familiar city. I ran my fingers along spines of books I had once assigned, once devoured, once loved. On the third shelf, tucked between volumes on post-war sculpture and feminist theory, I found a title I hadn't seen in years. The Silent Architect, Women Who Shaped Without Credit. I pulled it out, sat cross-legged on the floor, opened to the first page. The introduction read, Some women are the voice, others are the echo, but the ones who survive are the architects, quietly building what others later claim. I reread that paragraph 3 times. Later that evening, I shared it with my class, wrote it on the board in careful strokes. Luis raised his hand. Does that mean we're always building for someone else? I smiled. Only if we let them take the pen. After class, one of the other students, a woman in her 40s named Kendra, approached me. I've been thinking about going back to school full-time, she said. But everyone keeps telling me I'm too old, that I miss my window. I studied her face. How old do you think a window has to be before it closes? She paused, then smiled. Apparently older than I thought.
We laughed.
She left, and I stood alone in the hallway for a long time, feeling something rise in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Impact. That night, Brian sat at the table reading a work email when he looked up and asked, You're really happy in that class, aren't you? Yes, I said, without hesitation. He nodded. You're different. It's not just that you're busy. No, I said. It's not. He studied me for a long moment. Then he whispered, I think I miss you. And for the first time, I didn't say, I miss you too, because the truth was I didn't. Not the old me, and not the woman I had become to fit the edges of his life. But I didn't say that. I just met his eyes and said, I know. The invitation came on a Friday morning, tucked into an email titled, Faculty Showcase, Honoring Creative Voices in the Community. The message was brief but warm. We'd be honored to include you, Maya. Your return to the department has been deeply felt, and your students speak of you with such clarity and affection. If you're willing, we'd love for you to speak about your journey back to the classroom. Just 10 minutes. Nothing formal, just real. I reread the message 3 times before closing my laptop. It wasn't just the invite. It was who it came from, Dr. Elaine Monroe, the new department chair. I'd taught her once as an undergrad, back when she wore frayed sweaters and asked a million questions during office hours. Now, she was tenured, respected, and carrying the same fire I remembered in her. 10 minutes. Nothing formal, just real. That line echoed as I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing out my mug. The sun cast a soft golden wash through the window, warming the steam rising from the porcelain. 10 minutes. How do you sum up silence, reinvention, erasure, and return in 10 minutes? I accepted the invitation the same day. Later that evening, I told Brian over dinner. He looked up from his plate. So, you're giving a speech?
More like a talk, I said.
Just a small showcase for faculty. Creative reflections. Are you nervous? I shook my head. I'm ready. He nodded once, then went back to his dinner. No follow-up. No congratulations. Just a blink of acknowledgement. And for the first time, I didn't feel the sting of his silence. Because I didn't need his pride anymore to feel proud of myself. The day of the showcase, I wore the burgundy dress Julia had bought me last Christmas. She'd said, "It's bold. It's you." I hadn't believed her then. Now I did. The room was modest. Rows of chairs lined beneath framed student artwork, the walls washed in soft light from paper lanterns. A small podium stood at the front. Claire waved at me from the second row. Luis and Kendra were there too, seated near the back, notebooks in their laps. I wasn't the only speaker, but I was the only one who began like this. For a long time, I stopped raising my hand, not because I had nothing to say, but because I believed no one would hear me if I did. I told them about the pause in my career, about the quiet years, about how I thought comfort and disappearance were the same thing, and how I learned they were not. I spoke about negative space, about the art of making room, and about how sometimes we erase ourselves gently with small choices, with silence, and how choosing to be seen again isn't a scream, it's a return. I ended with this. We teach people how to see us. And when they stop looking, we have to look for ourselves. That's what art is. And that's what I'm still learning to do. Applause followed. Not loud, not raucous, but steady.
Real.
After the event, people came up to thank me. Some offered hugs. Some asked if I'd consider teaching a second seminar in the fall. And then he appeared. Matthew Hayes. He had once taught in the English department during my first year. We'd co-chaired a student showcase. He was married then, with 2 toddlers and an overfull briefcase. He wasn't married anymore. Still the best speaker in the room, he said with a grin, leaning against the doorway as I packed up my materials. I laughed. Hardly. I mean it, he said, stepping closer. You were always good. But tonight you were you again. His words landed too precisely. Thank you, I said, slipping the folder into my tote. We talked for a few minutes, catching up. He taught creative writing now at a nearby private college. His kids were in high school. He had lost his mother last spring. We fell into a rhythm that felt dangerously familiar. Then came the moment. You ever wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed in touch? I froze. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a proposition. But it was a signal. He looked at me, not with lust, not even with longing, but with the kind of gaze someone gives when they see through you. Not the mask, not the title.
Just you.
I stepped back, gently. I used to wonder about a lot of things, I said, but not anymore. He nodded slowly. I'm glad you're back. The department's better for it. And just like that, he walked away. I stood there for a moment, letting my heartbeat settle. Then I walked out into the cool evening and called Julia. She answered on the second ring. Hey, how'd it go? I spoke. People listened. And I think I remembered something I forgot for a long time. What's that? That being seen by others is nice. But seeing yourself? That's where it begins. The next morning, I set the framed program from the showcase on my desk in the guest room. Brian came in later with his coffee and stood at the door. Saw your picture on the university's Instagram. People are really proud of you. I turned. I'm proud of me too. He lingered, unsure of what to do with that honesty. I'm glad you're doing something for yourself, he said at last. I smiled. So am I. He left the room, and I turned back to the canvas I'd been working on. It wasn't finished. Just strokes, shapes, and outlines. But it was coming together. And this time, the subject was clear. It was me. No face. No scenery. Just a woman in motion. Becoming. It happened on a Sunday. The kind of Sunday that used to mean laundry, bills, errands. But lately, my Sundays had become quieter. Slower. More mine. That morning, I was in the garden pruning the dead rosemary. The plant had overgrown again, reaching out like it was begging to be noticed. I trimmed gently, not for beauty, but for breathability, so the roots could breathe again. Brian opened the screen door and stepped out onto the porch. He was barefoot, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't offered to share. "You're always out here lately," he said, squinting into the sunlight. "It's peaceful," I replied, brushing soil from my gloves. He didn't answer right away, just stared out over the yard like it was unfamiliar territory. Then he said, "I've been thinking, maybe we should take a weekend trip. Somewhere nice. That inn near the coast we used to like." I paused. That inn. The one with the white curtains and the bay windows, and the dinners we never stayed long enough to enjoy because he'd always get a work call. I hadn't thought of that place in years. He was looking at me the way someone looks at a photo of a vacation they barely remember, hoping nostalgia would do the work reality hadn't. I stood up and removed my gloves. "Why now?" He hesitated. "I don't know. Just feels like we've been drifting."
We.
The word used to mean both of us. Now it sounded like someone reaching out to a reflection. I nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." That night, I sat at my desk in the guest room. The room that had once been Ava's, then storage, now mine. A space reborn in quiet. I stared at the framed program from the faculty showcase. My name printed in serif font. My title below it, Professor Maya Lowell. Again. Beside it sat the old sketch of the rosemary bush, the one I had drawn weeks ago, back when I'd first pulled out my pencils again. It looked different now. Familiar, but stronger. Like it had grown since I last looked. Something inside me whispered, "You don't belong in the shadows anymore." The next day, I met with Dr. Monroe for coffee. We sat by the window of a small cafe on campus. She wore red-framed glasses and a navy blazer that made her look both serious and curious at the same time. "We're expanding the seminar series," she said, stirring her tea. "We'd love to have you design your own class. Something entirely yours." I blinked. "Like curriculum from scratch?" She smiled.
Exactly.
"We'd want to promote it. Give you a named course slot. You'd have full freedom." It should have been a moment of pure joy. But something in me trembled. Because full freedom meant full responsibility. Not just for the students. For myself. I would have to build something without shrinking to fit anyone else's story. And I wanted that. God, I wanted it. But I also knew what it meant. I'd have to choose. That evening, I sat across from Brian at dinner. We ate in silence for most of it. Not tense silence. Just the kind that says we've both run out of things to pretend. He finally asked, "So, what are you thinking about the trip?" I set down my fork. "Do you want the real answer?" He looked up. "Of course. I think I'm outgrowing this." He blinked. "This what? The trip?" "No," I said gently. "This version of us." His face stiffened. Not in anger. In disbelief. "I've tried, Brian. I've tried to come back to the rhythm we used to have. But I'm not the same woman you married. And I think you know that." He set his fork down too, as if we were negotiating a ceasefire. "I never asked you to change." "No," I said. "But you stopped seeing me when I did." He looked down, stared at the table. "I don't know how to fix that," he whispered. "I don't think you can," I replied. "Because it isn't broken in a way that needs fixing. It's just different now." I stood, walked to the hallway, and retrieved the folder from the university. I set it in front of him. "This is the new course I'm building. It starts in the fall. Full schedule. Long term. He flipped through the pages. This is a lot. It's what I want. He looked up. And where do I fit in that? I smiled softly. That's not the question anymore, Brian. The question is, do I still need to shrink so you'll fit in mine? The next morning, I didn't pack a bag for a weekend trip. I packed a bag for a weekend alone.
Just me.
A notepad. A change of clothes. The key to the lake cabin my parents left me, the one I'd quietly transferred into a trust months ago. When I told Brian I was going, he just nodded. When will you be back? I'm not sure. He didn't ask more. He didn't stop me. And I think that was the clearest answer either of us had given in years. As I drove north, past the highway signs and the thinning trees, I rolled down the window and let the air rush in, cold, fresh, unfiltered. The road curved ahead. Not a straight line. But I didn't need one anymore. Because I wasn't looking for the fastest way back. I was following the path forward. The cabin was just as I remembered it. Modest, musty, still. Dust particles danced in the sunlight that filtered through the blinds. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath my boots, and the faint scent of cedar and something older clung to the air. It wasn't grand. It wasn't luxurious. But it was mine. And the key turned in the lock without resistance. That detail hit me more than it should have. The door hadn't stuck. It welcomed me back. I set my bag down near the fireplace and opened the windows. A breeze rolled in, carrying the smell of pine, lake water, and something that felt like beginning. For hours, I did nothing. No lesson plans. No emails. No lists. Just breathing. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the dock. The lake was still half frozen along the edges, a stubborn memory of winter refusing to let go. I sat at the edge, my legs dangling over the water, and stared out at the horizon where the sky met trees in a hazy, forgiving line. And I asked myself the question I had been circling for weeks. If no one needed you, what would you do? It was a terrifying question, because I had built my life around being needed.
Wife.
Mother. Helper. Host. Even in teaching, there was purpose through service. But here alone, unnamed, I had to answer for no one but myself. What would I do? I'd write. I'd paint without thinking of galleries or feedback. I'd wake slowly. I'd take my coffee on the porch wrapped in a shawl, not a schedule. I'd stop asking if I was doing enough to earn love. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start asking if I was loving myself enough to stop earning anything at all. That night, I built a fire. The wood was dry, stacked neatly where I left it last summer. I cooked a simple dinner, mushrooms, lentils, toasted bread. I poured a glass of red wine and sat by the window with my notebook. No music, no distractions, just the crackle of flame and the scribble of my pen. Today I felt like I wasn't anyone's mirror, just skin and thought and bone. Not a reflection, just a shape that took up space, unapologetically. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I made coffee strong and black, wrapped myself in a blanket, and walked barefoot onto the porch. The floorboards were cold, grounding. I watched the sun rise slowly. No urgency, just certainty, like it knew it belonged here. And for the first time in years, I felt the same. Later that day, I stood in front of the hallway mirror, the one my father had nailed into place decades ago. It had warped slightly over the years, the frame chipping in the corners. Still, it held my image. No makeup, hair wild, sweater too large. And yet, I looked more like myself than I had in a long time. Not polished, not styled, just real. I whispered aloud, "You're not a version. You're a whole." The next few hours unfolded like memory. I walked trails I hadn't walked since Julia was little. Sat on the swing near the old maple and closed my eyes. Listened to wind through branches and birds with no agenda. That evening, I opened a new canvas. Not to paint anything specific. Just to move. Brush to surface. Color to space. No outline. No plan. Just motion. And somewhere in the motion, a shape formed. A woman, half turned, looking over her shoulder not with regret, but with quiet defiance. A suitcase in one hand, a brush in the other. The caption formed itself. Leaving was never about him. It was about choosing myself without asking permission. On the final night at the cabin, I stood in the middle of the small bedroom and said aloud, "What happens next?" The silence didn't answer. Because it didn't have to. I already knew. I wasn't going back to shrink again. But I didn't need to burn the house down either. I had outgrown a shape. And I was making space for the new one. When I drove home the next day, the roads felt shorter. The hills less daunting. I knew what waited at the end of the drive, an unfinished marriage, a man still struggling to see beyond the edges of his own comfort. But I wasn't returning to him. I was returning to my life with boundaries, with choices, with the door left slightly ajar. Just wide enough to walk through freely. Or walk away from completely. When I returned home from the cabin, the house looked exactly the same. Same porch light flickering faintly. Same rhododendrons overgrown by the walkway. Same glass bowl of keys on the entry table, none of which unlocked anything meaningful. Brian was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. A small olive oil spill shimmered beneath the cutting board. He didn't look up when I entered. Just said, "Hey, you're back." I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the silence hang between us like a fog neither of us wanted to walk through. "Yeah," I said. "I am." He turned finally. His eyes softened, but the space between us didn't. Did it help? The time away? Yes. He nodded once, the knife pausing mid-slice. "I thought a lot while you were gone." I stepped forward and set my bag on the table. "Me too." We didn't say more right away. We didn't need to. Because everything left unsaid had already shaped the walls we lived in. After dinner, I went upstairs to the guest room, my room, and sat at the desk. The evening light painted long amber lines across the wall. I pulled out my notebook and opened to a clean page. At the top, I wrote, "What does staying mean if you're no longer shrinking to fit?" I didn't answer it right away. Because the answer didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a room. Spacious. Quiet. Sunlit. The next morning, I called a contractor. The cabin needed repairs, new gutters, a few windows replaced, a sturdier deck. I gave him the go-ahead. Told him I'd send payment from the trust. Brian overheard me on the call. After I hung up, he asked, "Are you selling it?" "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "I'm renovating it." He stared for a moment, unsure of what that meant. Later that evening, he came into the room with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He set them down on the nightstand. "I was thinking," he began carefully, "maybe we could try counseling. Not to fix everything, just to talk. I don't want to lose you." I paused. It was the most direct thing he'd said in months. And it wasn't manipulative. It wasn't too late. It just wasn't enough. "I'm not angry anymore," I said softly. "But I think we've been standing still for so long, we've forgotten how to move forward together. And I don't know if I want to relearn that here." He nodded slowly, eyes cast down. "I understand. I believe you do." And that was something. That weekend, I visited Julia. We sat on her patio while Caleb played with sidewalk chalk at our feet. She poured tea and asked, "So, what now, Mom?" I smiled, slow and sure. "Now, I move into the cabin full-time. I teach. I paint. I finish building the life I stopped building for too long." She didn't try to talk me out of it. Didn't ask if I was sure. She just leaned over and hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you," she said again. Back at home, I packed slowly. Not in anger. Not in mourning. I left the wedding photo in the drawer. I took the framed faculty showcase program, the notebooks, the scarf Julia gave me, and the 3 favorite coffee mugs no one else used. Before I left, I wrote Brian a letter. Not to explain, but to close. "You were my partner for a long time. And even when you forgot how to see me, I never stopped wanting to be seen. I'm not leaving in rage. I'm leaving in light. Because staying silent in your own life is a kind of death. And I finally remembered how to live. I didn't sign it with regret. I signed it.
Maya.
Just Maya. That night, at the cabin, I lit a candle, and poured a glass of wine. I sat by the window with my feet curled beneath me and listened to the owls calling through the trees. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt open. I opened my notebook and wrote. I was never just comfortable. I was resilient. I was whole. I was waiting. But I'm not waiting anymore. I am in motion now. And the life I'm building doesn't ask me to disappear to be loved. The next morning, I woke with the sun, brewed my coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The deck was still rough, the roof still needed fixing. But it was mine. Every inch of it. And so was the woman standing on it. She didn't leave to escape him. She left to return to herself. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's still waiting to be seen.